Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia Synclavier-V tutorial series. Today we're going to take our first detailed look at the engine page. We're going to examine the concept of frames and timelines. Hope you're enjoying the series so far. If you are, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. Fabulous way to help support my channel. Okay, so here we have the simple sine preset, which, as you can expect, generates a sine tone. This preset is comprised of a single partial, only partial 1 is engaged, with the simplest possible carrier, a single sine wave. There's no modulator. Looking back over at the mixer section again, here's the FM mod at 0. So we are literally generating a single harmonic of this shape at whatever pitch I press. I'm pressing a C on the keyboard. You're hearing a C. Not particularly exciting. Let's make it do something more interesting. I'm going to click in the timeline menu, and if you drag up and down with your mouse, you can zoom in and out of the timeline. I'm just going to click anywhere in this viewer to create a new frame. So this is frame 1, which is, as we know, the second frame, because frame 0 is basic partial. As I toggle backwards and forwards between these partials, you can see the title updating and any information we have set on those frames. So when we look at frame 1, for instance, you can see that we have a frame time of about 5 seconds. So this timeline is describing the morphing or crossfading process from frame 0 to frame 1. Let's make the basic partial do something slightly more interesting. I'll transpose it 3 semitones. And so now when I press a C, initially we're going to hear a D sharp, and then we'll, over the course of 5 seconds, crossfade to a C. Here we go. Okay, that's the last time I'm going to ask you to wait 5 seconds for a crossfade. I'm going to drag this crossfade forwards to about 2.5 seconds. I'm going to pick up the little frame circle, drag it to 2.5 seconds, and as you can see, the fade time has changed. I could do it from inside the box as well. It's basically the same function. It's a little bit easier to do it from the main interface because you've got the right level of granularity however you zoomed. So now that fade time is 2.5 seconds. At exactly this point, we faded fully into frame 1. So the moment you hit this circle, you can't hear frame 0 anymore. It spends its time crossfading from 100% at this circle over to 0% at this circle. If I add a third frame at 5 seconds, then again, frame 1 is going to be at 100% at exactly and only this point, and then it'll crossfade down to 0% when frame 2 takes over. So let's make frame 2 go down by 2 semitones. So now we've got a 5 semitone spread starting at D sharp, and we're going to end up at A sharp. There's the D sharp, there's C exactly on the point. By the time we hit frame 2, we're at A sharp. Now each one of these frames also has a delay time, a period of time over which no crossfading will take place. So let's introduce a delay in frame 1. I'm going to increase the delay time by 1 second. What this means is that now when I press the note, we're going to hold at D sharp for 1 second before going anywhere. So for the entire period from the beginning of the frame to the delay point, we'll stick at exactly D sharp, and then we'll start our crossfade to the C. Here we go. D sharp exactly for 1 second, and then we started the crossfade. Now I can pick these little purple blocks up in the interface and move them easily enough as well. But there is a little issue here. I'm going to reduce the fade time of this frame to 0. Just drag in the box and pull it down. Can you see that the purple box is now superimposed over the fade time? Now, depending on which of these two user interface elements I picked up last, I've got a little bit of an issue when it comes to how to manipulate these two things, because basically I don't know what I'm picking. I don't know what I'm picking up when I click with the mouse. But you can explicitly enter edit delay mode. And now when I click on this section, I know I'm editing the delay. If I select edit fade, I now know I'm picking up the fade. So it's a little issue. It's not something that you particularly worry about. And for the majority of the time, edit fade is a perfectly reasonable option, because as you can see, if there's no overlapping of any of these options, you can pick them all up and drag them perfectly easily. And that's how we can set the delay times and crossfades from within the interface, and that's how I prefer to work. So just a very quick recap. Frame 0 is currently set to 3 semitones, frame 1 at 0, and frame 2 at -2. So far, they're all very simple single sine waves. Let's add some extra harmonics to frame 1. Now, we're not concentrating specifically on the harmonic editor today, but I do want to show you a couple of features that require me to just add a few harmonics. So I'm going to make it a very kind of basic square wavy sort of thing. So whilst we're crossfading between frame 1, we're now going to get a different tone. And then we'll fade back to a sine wave by the time we get to frame 2. This allows me to demonstrate the idea of duplicating frames. So now I'm going to hold the Alt button down on my keyboard, and with that button pressed down, I'm going to drag this frame to the right. Can you see it duplicated? And now these two frames are identical. Frames 1 and 2 are identical. We've created a new frame 2, and we've shoved the old frame 2 off into the distance. It's now frame 3. Let's edit frame 3 now, make it sound different. So I'm going to change odd harmonics to even harmonics. And we'll hear what that crossfade sounds like. The harshness of the odd harmonics and the softness of the even harmonics. Now if I pick up frame 2 and move it, can you see frame 3 moving along at the same rate? So basically I'm pushing everything to the right of it forwards in time. But if I hold the shift key down, now I'm just moving this frame within the context of the two to the left and right. So if I drag this one towards frame 1, the fade time between these two frames has reduced, but obviously fade time between frames 2 and 3 has increased. I'm holding the shift key down again just for clarity. Take the shift key off and I'm back to normal mode. Finally, I can copy and paste frame details. So if I want to copy frame 2 over onto frame 3, which is currently a simple sine wave, -2 semitones note, this one's still at 0 semitones. With frame 2 selected, I'm going to press copy, and then all of the frames start flashing. All I have to do now is click on the destination frame. So if I click the frame at the end, and then we select it, you can see that that new frame, apart from timeline information, which is obviously entirely specific to the timeline itself, but all the pertinent information for the frame, the transpose information, the harmonic information, that's all being copied across, and those two frames are now identical. Copy and pasting also works across partials. It doesn't appear to, but it does. Here we've got frame 2 selected with our even harmonics. I'm going to press the copy button. You can see that it's highlighted and all of the frames are flashing. If I jump over to partial 2, you no longer see the flashing frames, but it is still in copy mode. If I now select the basic partial, just going to click on the basic partial, all of that information is pasted from partial 1 into partial 2. So it is possible to copy and paste between partials. The interface doesn't give you much of a clue because the frames stop flashing, but the copy button itself, the copy tab is highlighted. That's the way that you can tell that you're still in copy mode. The interface is basically waiting for you to click on a frame and it'll paste that information across. Now, when we're auditioning timelines, sometimes you want to do some work on frame number 2. When you press the key, you've got to wait kind of 4 seconds for the timeline to actually catch up. If I double click on the frame, it gets bigger. We get this circle highlighted around it. Now that's the only frame that you'll hear. Now there is envelope information in the background that could also be having an impact on what you're hearing. We're not going to worry about that today. If I press a key, this tone that you're hearing is the even harmonic based sound of frame 2. Take it back out of solo mode and we're running through the timeline again. At this point, what I want to do is load up one of the preset sounds. I'm going to use that as basically a test harness to demonstrate some more of the features of frames and timelines. I'm going to go into the lead folder and I'm going to load up aggressive FM lead. If we have a look at the mixer, we can see that this sound is using 6 different partials. There are various features that we'll have to kind of dip into on some of the other pages. Let's not worry about that just for now. Let's hear what it sounds like. Let's break it down and figure out what we can derive about the frame and timeline information in this preset. The first thing that we're going to do is solo partial 1. Let's just have a listen to that on its own. So we've got this kind of pulsing effect going on as it's traveling through the timeline. How many partials have we got here? Let's click the last one. So 19 plus 1 for frame 0. We've got 20 frames in this timeline. And these little purple lines are giving you a clue as what's going on, because that's basically the current actual state of the harmonic indicator, rather than the harmonics that you can see in the currently selected frame, which happens to be the last frame in the sound. If I start off at basic partial 0 and start going forwards through the frames, watch the carrier shape. Now, it doesn't take very long to figure out that this sound is oscillating between two different harmonic profiles. This has been accomplished with the use of duplication. Basically, each one of these frames has been duplicated and then jumped over to the next frame. If I, for instance, want to create two new frames at the end of this timeline, I could duplicate frame 18 by Alt, click, drag. So here's the new frame that I've just created immediately to the right of my old frame. So how do I get that frame to where I want it to be? Basically, there are two frames here, two identical frames. I don't want these two to be sat next to each other. I want frame 19 to jump over this existing frame. Well, we can't if we're in standard mode, but of course we know that if we hold the Shift key down, then we get completely independent control of this frame. And at this point, we can jump over frames, and that's how you jump over frames if you've duplicated them. So now with the gently sloping frame selected, which is 19, again, I can click Alt, create the copy, hold the Shift key down, drag that frame across, and I've just duplicated two new frames onto the end of the timeline so that I'm following the same pattern that the rest of the preset does. So a little bit of manipulation of your Alt and Shift keys, learning how to duplicate and copy frames, and you can very quickly create really interesting harmonic profiles. Let's get rid of those two sounds, back to the basic effect. I can double click in the timeline to basically zoom full so that I can see all of the frames in the timeline. Now let's solo partial number 2 and have a listen to this sound. Now it's thinner, it's got a different kind of tonal profile to it. Again, that's coming from somewhere else in the system. That's coming from differences of the FM settings in the mixer. Have a very quick look. These controls over here are primarily what are making it sound different, but actually these two partials are essentially identical. Here's the basic partial for partial number 1. Here's the basic partial for partial number 2. And as you can see, we've got different modulators. Like I said, there is tonal difference going on here, but it's nothing to do with the harmonic profile. As we scan through each of these partials, comparing them side by side, you can see that the actual information, the waveform of each of these partials is identical. That will have been accomplished with the global copy and pasting. So with partial 1 selected, I can copy it, and then I'm getting the little download symbol. Where do I want to paste it? I'll paste it over to partial 9 so that it's not causing any havoc. That's now an exact copy of the existing partial. I'll just throw all of those changes away, jump forwards, jump back, so we get back to our basic sound. The reason this partial's been duplicated and copied across to partial 2 is that partial 2 is more or less identical, those tonal differences aside, but this time you're going to hear it predominantly in the right ear. Partial 1 is your left ear sound. Bring them both in. Got a thick, fat pad panned across the stereo field, but fundamentally the two partials are following the same timeline. They're pulsing effectively in sympathy with each other. So let's have a bit of a play with that pulsing sound. As we're traveling through the timeline, we're getting the different harmonic profiles. But when we get to the end, we flatten out. Whatever the last frame happens to be, that's the harmonic profile that's going to be used from that point onwards. Let's introduce a loop to make that not be the case. Now I'm going to experiment with my loop settings on just partial 1, so we'll be kind of left ear dominant, but it doesn't particularly matter. I'm going to engage loop mode, and we'll start off by having the loop cycle backwards and forwards. You see these two purple markers that appeared when I engaged loop mode? Those are your loop points. So when it gets to the end of the timeline, it's going to basically hit this marker and bounce back on itself. We can increase the speed of the entire timeline, basically an offset value. So frame speed in the timeline settings is going to set the frame speed for just this partial. In other words, we're going to speed it up relative to all the other partials. It's already slightly faster than other stuff that's going on in this preset. As you can see, it's set to 1.2, but the maximum speed is 2.5. So if we turn it all the way up to 2.5, now I've got a faster pulse. We can change the loop marker points. The easiest way to do it is actually inside the interface, but it's the start and end values here. As I click and drag this through, I can change any 2 loop points. So now it's just going to cycle around this center point. And you want to make sure that your loop points are sympathetic with whatever's going on tonally. Now, forwards and backwards will often hide a lot of the problems that you might have with looping, because you've always got this kind of seamless, whatever's going on at the end is going to be a negative, a reverse image of what's going to happen as it's playing backwards. If we get it looping round in forward only mode, I can highlight a new issue with looping. That sounds absolutely fine at the moment, because the frame that we're fading out of is the correct context for the frame that we're fading into. So the end frame corresponds to the beginning frame. That's exactly how you want. If you make that loop one step smaller, then you're going to generate a new effect, because you've broken that on-off kind of nature of this pulsing sound. And that's not even necessarily a bad thing. You can actually get some quite interesting effects, particularly with stereo sounds like this, using the different kind of loop options. I'll throw all of those changes away to make sure everything's nice and clean. And this time what I'm going to do is, in partial 1, I'm going to go forward only. And so that we don't have to wait for ages, I'll just do it over loop points 2 to 6. In partial 2, I'm going to create the same loop points, but this time we'll go forwards and backwards. So I still want loop mode 2 to 6. Extra little dimension to the sound as the waves are basically crossing over, creating like a double helix sort of thing. Let's have a look at another example from this preset. Let's have a listen to partials 3 and 4, hear what they sound like. So we have a simpler time frame this time. Double click to make sure that we can see everything. We've got 4 frames to look at. And if we have a quick look at the mixer, just to make sure that everything's in order, as far as our FM modulation is set to non-zero. The partials are more significantly detuned against each other, so that's going to be an interesting kind of effect to listen for. In terms of the harmonic profiles, we've got a simple sine wave being modulated, then a sawtooth kind of thing with basically all of the harmonics. And we've got quite an interesting sound going on with frame 2, we'll have a look at that in a moment, and then frame 3 back to a simple sine wave. These partials are also basically duplicated in the same way that partials 1 and 2 were, so we're primarily getting the stereo effect, but you can also see even the modulator settings have been copied across from partial 3 into partial 4. Let's isolate partial 3, see what else we can learn from this one. I'll follow it through the timeline as it crossfades between the partials. So we start off with our sine wave, we get to the sawtooth, then this quite soft sound, and we finish off at the sine wave at the end. All of that is being modulated. You have to bear in mind it's always having an effect. Now let's have a listen to partial 4, which is harmonically identical. Now there's something going on. It's obviously very clearly in the right ear, but there's also another effect that's going on here. I'll touch on it very briefly today just so that it doesn't cause any confusion. But the reason why partial 4 is oscillating so much faster than partial 3 is actually an effect from the envelope page. It's a byproduct of this stereo module, which will take quite a bit of examination, but they've actually got different rate settings. It's this BPM times 4 compared with the BPM times 3. Essentially, the stereo unit allows you to generate kind of pan and or tremolo effects. Super interesting, lots of stuff to do with phase that we need to talk about. But that's where the primary difference in sound comes. When we engage both of those sounds simultaneously, we get that lovely panned effect that's traveling through the timeline, morphing between these different frame types. So let's solo both of the frame 2s and have a listen to what this sounds like on its own. Ignoring the envelope effect, there's always something else to look at in this synthesizer, but just listening to that sound, that's a really nice harmonic profile. Let's see what it sounds like completely on its own, detached from the rest of the partial settings. So I can press copy, go over to an empty partial, click paste, and now we just have these carrier harmonics with none of the other mixer settings. Partial 9 is basically flat. See what that sounds like on its own. Helps if you turn it up. So that's what that harmonic profile sounds like without any of the other effects from the preset, basically kind of colouring the sound. We'll stop there for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.